who have kindly agreed to come and talk about their work today and answer questions. I just want to emphasize at the beginning that this is supposed to be like a collaborative discussion and casual, so feel free to chime in or speak up anytime you have something to add or a question, anything you like. You don't have to feel like you have to wait for the end or anything. We're going to start with some brief introductions from our guests and then kind of just jump into the discussion. So I'll introduce our three guests that we have today. We have Karen. If Karen, I don't know if you want to wave. Wow, there's so many people in the chat box now that it's hard to see everybody. That's fantastic. But Karen Knutson comes from the University of Pittsburgh Center for Learning in Out-of-School Environments. She's the associate director there, and she's going to talk to us about her work with Busy. We also have Matt Cannady of the Lawrence Hall of Science. And we have Ryan Auster of the Museum of Science, Boston. Thanks for waving. Hopefully I didn't butcher anyone's names there. I think that's the first time I've had to say them all out loud. I think I'd also, if it's not too much hassle, like to go through our participants who are here. If you want to, let's see. Yeah, there's a lot of you, but I'd still love to hear from each of you, just a sentence or two about your general interest in today's topic and where you're from. And maybe I'll just go left to right on my screen. So Amy, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Here. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Hi, I'm Amy Grock-Nielsen. I'm an evaluation research manager at the Science Museum of Minnesota.
And any particular interest or question bring you to our web chat today?
Oh, sure. I guess this is just a topic that I'm really interested in because a lot of the work I've been doing has been around creating measures of shared outcomes or constructs, and so I just wanted to be here today to participate through thinking around this. And I'm also working with some of the other people on this call on a case task force around common measures, so this will be useful for our work on that task force as well.
Great. And then going down the line, I see Grace. Oops, sorry, muted myself. Grace, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Grace Troxel, and I'm from CASE, and I'm interested in this web chat because CASE has done some work in the past around common measures, and I would like to learn about any new developments.
Thank you, and next up is Hannah. We're figuring out the technology, which is fine. It'll take a moment. There we go. Oh, I think our mic isn't your mic isn't picking up. Can anyone else hear Hannah?
Nope.
If you want to just type a hello in the chat box, you can, Hannah. I don't know why the audio isn't working. And in the meantime, maybe we can move on to Jamie, if you'd like to say hello.
Hi. Hi.
Hi.
I'm Jamie Bell from CASE. And as Grace said, we have done some work in the past in common measures. We had a convening in 2013 on evaluation capacity building, and a big strand of discussion there was around common measures, which then led to a smaller meeting about it, and we've been kind of following the progress of that discussion since, and so we're delighted to know that this was going on today, so we can catch up with current thinking on it. So thank you for hosting it.
Great, thank you for joining us. Karen, I'll skip over you since we'll be coming back to your project in more depth in a moment. How about Kim? Oh, and I see Hannah typed us a hello over in the chat box. And if anyone doesn't know how to see the chat, you just hover your mouse at the left side and click on the little blue quote box there, and you can see the chats. Sorry, Kim, did you want to say hello? That's okay. Maybe we can get you going in the discussion later. How about Stephen?
Hi, I'm Stephen Ashton from Thanksgiving Point, and I'm interested in this because we applied for an IMLS leadership grant to help measure social impact throughout museums, and we've on this grant we partnered up with Indianapolis. And I see Susan's here, and Kim, who is from a Children's Museum of Houston, is also there. So anyway, I'm interested in this to see what kind of common measures are being used and how we might apply that if we happen to get the grant.
Great. And then last but not least, I have Susan.
Hi, I don't know, is my microphone working?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I couldn't get my camera to work. Hi, I'm Susan Fouts at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. As Stephen said, we're partnering with them. We're also a member of the Children's Museum Research Network, and so just to have interests similar to other folks. And then also this summer at the VSA conference, Renee Young's, Ely Wood, and I are presenting on a risk and rewards, I think, how to balance issues of reliability and validity in visitor studies. So just common interests as everyone else has shared.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for humoring me and taking the time to introduce yourself. I think that will help all our guests, frame the discussion in a way that's useful to all of you. And we didn't really decide on a particular order of speaking. So Karen and Mac and Ryan, do any one of you three want to be first to kind of describe your project in brief and kick us off?
Sure, I'll kick us off.
All right.
I think the idea for this webinar came out of a session that we did at VSA last year, and Mac was in that session along with me, and Ryan was in a different session, and realized there's like a lot of interest in this topic. The study that I'm talking about today it comes from the BUSY project, which was a Building Informal Science Education project. And Amy was actually involved in that, a pretty important part of that project, which started by looking across all the evaluation reports that have been posted on informalscience.org over the years. And we did a big analysis looking across those and realized that it's actually pretty hard for our field to figure out how to come up with common measures and to generalize about what we've been learning. So the study that we then started work on was to try and do a common measures kind of study. And so we selected 7 natural history museums that had dinosaur halls. We found we really needed to try and bound the content as much as possible there. And we iteratively designed measures for the study that we would do with colleagues around the field to figure out the kinds of things that people, evaluators in the field, might find most useful. So we knew that one thing to do multi-site study was that we needed to have quick and easy kinds of measures that could be administered across different sites. We needed to figure out what else was really important to us there. We had to figure out in the study also, we wanted to sort of move our thinking along in terms of how we would measure learning. So we did a bunch of different kinds of measurements of learning, from looking at behaviors that people were doing, looking at conversations and sort of the social interaction between family groups. And then we looked at rating learning based on a range of different statements about content that they'd seen in the exhibit. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we were looking at. I think it'll be interesting for us to discuss as a group sort of shortcomings, difficulties, challenges, and great opportunities for this work.
Thanks, Karen. And did you want me to share your slide at this time, or?
Sure, if you have access to that.
Yeah, let me screen share real quickly here. Can everyone see that?
No.
Oh.
If we click on your video image, then it comes up.
Oh, okay.
I have no idea.
Karen is not
So
showing up for you.
I can't see the slide, but I'm thinking what I put in there was something about the actual statistical methods that we used for the project. So we did a survey study and across all the sites, and we had each person in a family unit fill out the survey, and then we used hierarchical linear modeling to sort of distill down exclude the effects of demographics of the individuals, of the families, and then the museums. And then I'm not showing you, I think, the results slide, which shows the incredible and very interesting variation among sites that we saw when we sort of factored out all of the impacts of those various features. Does that make sense with the slide you're seeing? Because I still don't see the slide.
I don't know if I have the results slide, but I do have one about using HLM to assess individual, family, and museum level interactions. That's the one I've got up. Sorry about that. Okay, these web chats are a technological learning experience for me, so I appreciate everyone's patience in that. Well, thanks for sharing, Karen, about your project. Who would like to briefly describe theirs next?
I'm happy to go.
Sure.
I'm also going to try and screen share because I did make some slides just to walk through the background of the project. I think the slides are definitely much more attractive than my face. So if you wouldn't mind bearing with me here as I figure this out. Let's see. So can everyone see my slides? Whoops.
I can.
Can you still see my slides? The gooder slides now? Perfect. All right, so I'm going to try and walk through the background on the Collaboration for Ongoing Visitor Experience Studies, which we affectionately refer to as COVES. And COVES is attempting to unify visitor data collection across science centers. So about 5 years ago at the Museum of Science, we started getting questions about how our visitor experience study was comparing to other science centers, which a lot of our senior level officers were considering our peers. And at that point, we didn't have data to compare. So we started kind of talking to other individuals in this area and realized that we didn't have any good points of comparison about visitor experience studies. So we created this collaboration to try and make our effort of studying the visitor experience systematic. And we realized that when we thought about science centers as a whole, one of the biggest shortcomings was the lack of evaluation capacity in many smaller science centers. And we thought that if we leveraged our existing capacity at some of the larger science centers, we could really increase evaluation capacity as a whole across the field. The biggest outcome for this effort is definitely going to be to provide comparable data points in the future for both institutions and some field-wide discussions around visitor experiences at science centers. Our current organizational structure, as you can see, has 10 governing body members, and I think this is very important to share when we talk about common measures across institutions, because these 10 members representing the governing body, along with the project staff, including our administrative team and our research team, which I'm a part of, are the ones who are making a lot of the decisions around what we're studying when we consider this systematic effort to study the visitor experience. It's not one institution, it's not one individual, it's not a small team. It's a much larger team who are focused on how we should approach this visitor study effort. I'm going to talk about the participating institutions in a little bit, but first I want to focus on the pilot study that got COVES kickstarted. Before thinking about the data that we were collecting from visitors, we wanted to study our methods first. And so we tried a few different data collection methodologies, which you can see here, included the interview, an on-site exit survey, and then an emailed survey in which we would collect the visitor email address ahead of time. We also tested two different sampling methods, both the group sampling and individual sampling, to see if data differed when we sampled an individual from a group versus a specific individual within a group. And we were primarily interested in response rates and the time it took to collect data from a feasibility standpoint to help guide our methods, because we knew that whatever method we were to decide upon needed to be applicable at every institution that wanted to participate in COVES, not just the few who could do something reliably. Bolded here is the emphasis on data quality, because we also did test the data between these different methods to ensure that we were getting high quality data. And in the end, we ended up selecting the on-site exit survey and the group sampling method as the two methods that produce the highest response rates and the fastest data collection time across institutions. There are 8 institutions represented on this map, and these are the 8 institutions that were part of the original cohort where we pilot tested the COVES system. And we have grown to 19 across the country, so we're pretty happy with this growth within our grant-funded period, as we're supported by IMLS right now. And this group of 19, as you can see, shows much more geographic spread than we had originally, and represents institutions who see only 10,000 visitors annually to institutions that represent well over 1 million visitors annually. So again, you can see the diversity of institution here is really important. I'm actually going to skip through some of the data stuff because I don't think it's that interesting, even though I know we're all data geeks and data is really what we love. But I think that focusing on what questions we're currently asking might be more valuable when we consider visitor studies across institutions. And so we currently ask a number of experience ratings, as you can see here, in terms of what the museum provided, an overall experience question, and then several indicators about how the experience might impact an overall rating, so including how well the exhibits were working, staff member helpfulness, cleanliness of the restrooms, and then cafe or gift shop experiences as applicable. We also ask about a number of motivations for visiting, because we know that that has a significant impact on the visitor perception of the museum experience. And then we ask some common group composition questions, which you can see here, and then traits of the survey taker, which you can see here. These items represent what we're considering the core COVES instrument. So these are items that are common for all of the science centers. But then we have some institution-specific questions as well, including what did you see or do at the museum today? And those are specific to the institution. And we're working on making a few more institution-specific questions as well before we proceed to expanding our survey instrument. I do want to point out a few challenges that we've encountered on this road to producing a system for science centers, namely that there are data collection challenges at a few sites. And by that I mean sites that aren't fully bought in struggle to collect sufficient data to produce a sample size large enough to really be comparable. And we're currently working on assisting those sites with data collection methods. There's always an institutional buy-in question. Where does the institutional buy-in come from? Is it one champion that perceives this as being a very valuable effort? or is it more widespread throughout the museum? Creating a culture of change must come from within. It's very hard for Coves or any one person to go in and say, these are the data, you should trust the data, and here's how you use it. The institution themselves need to be very reliant and able to make use of the data, and we're working on evaluation capacity efforts for that as well. And lastly, we're working on a better reporting mechanism. In the first 6 months of data collection, we really struggled with getting institutions timely data. And as we scale up and have more institutions involved, we know that this is going to be more and more significant in allowing institutions to make use of it. So thank you for bearing with me on that not so brief overview.
Thank you, Ryan. That was perfect. And Mac, would you like to tell us about your project?
Yeah, that'd be great. So I'm Mac Cannady, and I'm going to talk about the Activation Lab, and I think it's great that it's a good example of a contrast with different perspectives with Ryan just presenting a project that was really focused on creating shared measures across museums versus the Activation Lab where it came more from a research and learning sciences approach of really trying to understand what positions youth for future success. So trying to understand what constructs and what are the things that youth would carry with them after a learning environment that are going to put them in a place for success in the next environment. And so I've been working on that for about 6 years, along with several of the other people on this call. So apologies if I get anything wrong, and please correct it. But what we did through that work is, if you click on Claire's slide there, she's got it up, we identified some constructs that we now say are a part of activation. So these are things that you've seen before. We're just sort of reifying them and putting them forward as a collective set, and we think about them working together to position youth for success. So there's aspects of their fascination, what some people might consider like curiosity, or there's aspects of values. So they're valuing what science does for them and for the society writ large, the way they think about their ability to do science and scientific sense making. That is the cognitive process of making sense of information, so that they're having to provide explanations that they themselves feel are sufficient to explain natural phenomena. And so the idea was, searching through the literature to identify what these constructs are. But we've been working on since is actually running studies that show that each of these constructs are actually predictive of those successes. So choosing more science, engaging when you're there, perceiving that you've succeeded in environments, and that you've learned the content there. And then I'm getting a little bit of echo. Am I the only one getting the echo?
Whoa.
Sorry.
Ryan, maybe if you mute yourself. I just muted myself. Sometimes that helps if the rest of us mute.
Ryan looks muted.
Okay.
Is this better? Yes? Okay, nodding heads. Thank you. Sorry about that. So then the more theoretical part is that would position youth for later success towards STEM literacy and careers. So that part, requires the longer study. But because we engaged in this work, we now have these survey tools to measure all these constructs, and we use them as a part of our own research effort across a lot of different evaluation projects that we do with different learning environments. And we got a grant a couple years ago actually to enable other organizations to use these tools themselves. And so if now I start sharing a little bit too, oops, wrong button, this one.
Mac, are you frozen?
Did we lose him?
He looks pretty good just the way he is. I think this is. Uh-oh.
We might have. Oh, here we go.
He's back.
Yes.
I'm back. Just wanted to throw a little wrench in it. Sorry about that. I'm not sure if I am sharing my screen.
Not yet.
Okay. Try it again. Where I was just going to is what we've created is this website, the activationlab.org toolkit, where individuals can go through and actually use the tools themselves to develop a survey instrument that they can use and collect their own data, and you no longer need to reach out to us. So if you fill out this little survey construction tool, identify which scales that you would like to use for your environment, collect the data yourself, and it sends it to you. It sends you a Google form with the surveys in it, which then feeds it into a Google sheet that you can use for your data. So that's where we're at. It's a project that is now exploring how to share across different museums, but didn't come in with that sort of intentional setup from the start. And sorry for all the technical issues while I was talking.
No problem. We worked with it. So thank you so much, you three, for giving us an overview of your projects. I know it's not long enough to fully do justice to them, but I think it gives us a starting point to start chatting. And I have a long list of my own questions, but I'd like to throw it out to our participants first. If there's anything that you would like to ask based on what you've heard so far. And you can always also use the chat box, and I will read those questions aloud if something comes to you, whenever you think of it. Feel free to put it in there. I'll give it a bit of a pause before I ask my first one. I don't see anyone unmuting.
I'm going to jump in. So, Mac, thinking about the customizable survey.
Yes.
You mentioned that we could go to the website and kind of like self-select the scales or aspects of the instrument that we want embedded, and then there's a Google form that's produced. So does that mean that the survey instrument comes to us in a Google form, or that is then the data collection mechanism, like data goes into a Google Doc or something?
Good question. You actually can select you can select the scales, and if you want to do it with paper and pencil, it'll send you the PDFs with those scales. If you want to do it online, I think you can have a Google form. If you want to be able to do it offline, there's but with a tablet or something, we have a different system that allows you to do it that way. So does that answer your question?
Yes, great, perfect.
But play with it and see if you can break it, because we're figuring it out.
Sure. I'm confident if anyone can break it, I can.
I wonder if the three of you can maybe just give your input briefly on what you think the value is of having these instruments that can be used across different institutions. I know it's slightly different for your different projects, so I think that would be an interesting thing to talk about.
So I'll start. Sorry, Mac, I'll give a quick example. And having just presented at AAM on this issue, I know that there are certain types of measurement that are contentious depending on what you want to learn about your visitors. But one easy example is the Net Promoter Score. A lot of different institutions use it to kind of evaluate how they're doing overall. And when we started this effort to make studying the visitor experience systematic, we asked specifically about the Net Promoter Score, and we learned that people were asking different variations of what they thought were the same question in very different ways. How would you rate, or how likely are you to recommend our museum to your friend? How likely are you to recommend our museum to a friend or colleague on scales from 1 to 5, on scales from 0 to 10, on scales from 1 to 10? And as soon as we talked about trying to compare those numbers, we found that it was very difficult. So one thing we did was we made the question the same for all institutions. And then we made the method of data collection the same for all institutions. So I think one of the aspects that's very valuable about creating these types of instruments is that you then have the ability to compare results from one place to another. Now, I'm not trying to say that results produced by COVES will be generalizable to every science center, but I'm saying that the results in one science center are reliable when put in the context of the other science centers who are participating, and for us, that's very valuable.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I'm going to answer that in a different way. Am I having technical difficulties again? Can you hear me okay? Seems really choppy. Can you hear me? Can somebody?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. So from our perspective, we were getting asked very often to create a survey to measure the same sorts of things. We're creating learning environments. In addition to museums, we're looking at the same constructs, and we found that we were often spending a lot of time developing new surveys for each boutique program that we were being asked to evaluate. And yet there was a lot of similarity and a lot of goals that projects wanted to be achieving around competency, belief, and fascination. And then we would ask us for the advice about what their goals might, what things they should be measuring. And so rather than coming from what are people aiming to do, we tried to understand what is it from a learning environment or learning experience, whether it's in a museum or an after-school program or in school itself, what are the things that would carry forward? And so then in the development of those survey instruments, we spend enough time, the process of development is very psychometrically rigorous with Roche modeling and measurement and variance tests, so that we can bring that level of expertise of measurement development for projects that might not otherwise have the ability to spend that amount of time and really resources and a lot of funding to develop those surveys. And now these are rigorous surveys that, if they align with those constructs, they can be used widely across these organizations.
I'm curious, Mac, if do you provide guidance on how these surveys should be administered?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one of the things that we sort of are attempting to balance with that toolkit website is, we don't want to do evaluation 101 in a website. It's beyond what we really feel like we can position people for, but there is a process of at least helping people to think through if these constructs actually align with the program that they're working on, and therefore they should be using this as a tool for assessing progress. So if your program is about math, then maybe these science learning activation surveys are not the right tool for you, as an example of the kinds of information that we would be providing there. But we give advice about administration, but recognize that there's such variety in where these might be used. It's hard for us to know what's right for each environment, and so there's some assumption about how to do evaluation that we do assume of the users.
I see Jen has asked, are there examples of limitations? For example, places you found where common measures have more limited utility?
Well, I can start. For me, the most common one is that the constructs don't align, that it's not an appropriate place or a tool for that environment. Another one for us, the tools are mostly, they look like school. I mean, there are survey items with Likert, yes to no scales. And so it's not always in this ethos of the learning environment to be handing someone a survey tool that looks like that. And so those are some of the limitations around the utility.
I think what we noticed from our project is that the environments that we're working in are so incredibly diverse that it only really gets you. There's just still so much variation out there that we're trying to deal with. So I think I don't know. It can be challenging for sure.
So Karen, for your project, you said it was these surveys were being used in dinosaur halls, specifically within natural history museums.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see any of those measures working in other types of science museum exhibits, or has there been any attempt to move them to other contexts?
No, this project was really specifically about the dinosaur halls, and we were really exploring specific learning measures for that. The other questions on the surveys about demographics and motivations for visitings and things like that could be used in other settings. But definitely agree with Mac, the kind of project that we did, having people fill out pretty lengthy surveys is kind of runs counter to the experience in a museum setting. So you'd really want to be using a tool like this to find out something that's going to be really useful for you. And, it is really incredibly useful as you start to think about something like a dinosaur hall, or understanding what are the specific factors that lead to more, stronger learning signals.
I'm wondering if any of our participants have experience using common measures that they'd like to share. If there's anything, if you've tried adapting surveying items for your own institutional context before, and what were the challenges there?
So I can share an example. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
So I'm part of a EvalFest project where we took the engagement survey from the activation lab to try and see if we could use it in a science festival context. And so we did testing with it. We did think alouds at the festival where we talked to both kids and adults to see if it would work in this other context that it wasn't created for, and with a different audience. And in that instance, I think it speaks to the importance of testing the survey in new, if you're using it with different audiences or different settings, because it worked when we were using it after people interacted with like a booth or a hands-on activity or demonstration, but the community was interested in seeing if it would work for an entire day, an entire science festival experience, and that's where we found that it didn't work, because how the construct of engagement with the activation lab, there's items that ask about like how engaged you are throughout your time having that experience by doing certain things, where if you're at a festival, there's times where people may stop and visit with people in the community, or they may stop to eat or do different things, which doesn't mean they aren't engaged in the whole day. It's just that's also part of that activity and that experience. So in that case, we found that it didn't. We had a sense it probably wouldn't work in that to use it in that way, and Mac was involved with that as well. But we wanted to gather data to see if indeed it worked or not. So I think it just spoke to the limitations of how that instrument could be used or not used.
I think the biggest challenge for us is like as we move along this path, like all these experiences are so different. You really have to kind of put a lot of constraints around your questions so that it will be applicable to all these different settings. And so we wind up with measures that are really quite simplified, oversimplified. So that's a big challenge for us.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that comes up for me that I hear is that the place where they work is when the goals are common. So it's less trying to find what's the right instrument to use across these. It's identifying what are those common goals. So Ryan's talking about the net promoter score. Well, if that's the common goal that many of these organizations can agree upon, then we can have the same way of measuring it. But let's not start with the measure and then implement that everywhere. So I think the framing the conversation around the measures can be helpful, and I think there's also the issues about trying to identify what the goals and the outcomes should be, and then look for the measures. It's like Jennifer asked another question.
Yeah, I'll read Jen's question aloud. What kind of range in data and responses have people found across institutions, and how did institutions seek to interpret the potential meaning or causes of those differences? And I think, Karen, you mentioned controlling for some of those differences. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to share a slide. It seems like it could be extremely challenging, but I can try. Is it going to share what's on my display, or
It should let you select which window on your computer you want to share.
Oh, there you go. I could share a picture of you. I could share this one.
There we go.
So this is, can you see this?
Yep.
Can you make it bigger? Can you make the slide fill the... Yeah.
So this is some simplified results of our study, and that was in the PowerPoint that I did at VSA, and we sort of have lumped different categories of questions that we thought museums would find interesting. And this is showing you variation by museum, and it's controlled. The answers are controlled for demographics and all sorts of variables. And so this is sort of gives you the amount to which a particular museum diverts from the norm. So if 0 is sort of the baseline, and then Museum 7 scored relatively much higher on the learning composite than did Museum 2. So you could see there that this was quite provocative, I think, for our museum partners that we've shared this with. But I think, it's all in the interpretation. And so figuring out how to explain the results of the study. It's not like this was not an evaluation study per se. It's showing you that there's something quite different that's happening in different museum sites. So I think that's a real challenge for us going forward, because we've controlled for the fact that it's an interesting thing about this method. You can say, oh, well, but our museum only attracts this kind of person or has this kind of thing. And the hierarchical linear modeling essentially is controlling for that, those kind of details. So we're seeing some sort of other impacts happening here.
Karen, when you share that with museums and get that feedback, do you tell them you're Museum 5, or do you not share that?
We have, if they've asked, yes, we have shared with them who they are. We haven't shared who the other museums are.
Of course.
But I don't know. I think we're probably more worried about it than we should be, but I don't know. I think it's hard, especially with a method like this that's pretty complicated statistically, to make that you're conveying. It's not an evaluation of your museum. It's showing you there's some interesting impacts there. And our next level of analysis will be to figure out specific factors in the exhibit environment. Because while we try to control for a lot of stuff, the actual exhibit experiences are quite different. And we haven't input that into these models.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Susan from Indianapolis. That's just the question I was going to ask Karen. To what degree did you control for, or could you, use as a factor in the study what they were designing for? Were they designing for family interaction? We had conversations of this sort when we were just at the Children's Museum Research Network, because we're trying to do collaborative research, and we all mean something different by parent engagement. And, so how do we even get started? So I kind of wonder how you're going to tackle that when you look across these different dinosaur halls.
Yeah, we've, the categories I was showing you, individual, exhibit, engagement, that's sort of our conglomerate of activity and behavior things. So did they use this or do that while they were in the exhibit? So that's a lot of specific information about the experiences. But we also have a lot of, if we ever get to the stage, this is a research point, I guess, and the turnaround time that Ryan was talking about, it's really taking forever to get to the point of wrapping up this round of the study. The next round of the study is to really unpack the exhibit characteristics, and we have walkthroughs of the exhibit spaces and tons of information that we can use to figure out what the factors are that we want to put in the model to do with exhibits and museum experiences specifically. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Sorry, I had to unmute.
I can, I'll try and go back to a few of my slides as well to talk about how we're beginning to share our data. Oh boy. I think this would get easier as I do it more often. Whoa. Okay, so you can see here, this is some of the preliminary data that we shared at AAM, which presents an aggregate picture. So just from the first, 10 months of data, 9 or 10 months of data, we've collected over 4,800 surveys. But you can see that our sample size within an institution ranges from 58 to 690, which is a huge discrepancy. Now, the sample size targets for institutions varied depending on their size or their visitor flow. So we expected those numbers to range a lot, but the point was not to compare each institution to every other institution. It was to compare, again, this idea of peers, and we're still trying to establish what it means to be a peer institution. Is it based on urbanicity? Is it based on the total, annual visitor number? Is it based on exhibit hall size? And so we're still trying to put that in context. Some of the data points that aren't even really data points, like how long the survey takes, what the response rate is. And right now, we're not trying to say this is good or this is bad, right? How long it takes your visitor to complete the survey or what a good response rate is. We're just sharing what some of the aggregate or average numbers are and then showing the institutional range. So you can see that for the average response rate of 59%, the institutional range goes from 30% to 96%, which is a huge range. And we find that correlates very strongly with how large the institution is, where they're positioned geographically, and how many visitors go through their institution daily. But for something like Net Promoter Score, again, I'm using this because it is an easy thing to break down for us. The aggregated Net Promoter Score is 71, but the Cove's range is 58 to 79. And we're still trying to parse out what a good range is, what an acceptable range is. Should it differ based on the size of the museum? And how we make subjective judgments about that, and therefore how we use it as well.
Not to interrupt your train of thought, Ryan, but
yeah.
You said that the response rate is correlated with the size of the museum?
Yeah.
In what direction?
Smaller is higher.
Smaller museum is higher response rate.
And I think, this is Susan again. I was involved with a study a number of years ago with the museum in Gainesville. Of course, I can't remember their name now. And Jim Kissel was also involved in the study. And we were collecting data with the same instrument across 6 different sites, and it was all about evolution. And I was the data collector, the lead data collector at the Natural History Museum on the Mall, the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. And we had the lowest response rate. And there was the question, why is your response rate so very low? And I said, well, have you ever visited the Smithsonian and seen how people go through the Smithsonian? It's very different from going to a museum in Gainesville or the one that was in central Kansas. So the fact that we had a 50% refusal rate, I wasn't surprised by, but other people were shocked when they were seeing, only 25% of people were refusing, or even sometimes fewer than that.
Yeah. The larger the museum, the lower the response rate, but also the higher, I'll call it stay time or dwell time on the survey itself. So visitors at smaller institutions are spending longer on the survey, and those institutions have a higher response rate. It's like this local feel, and I will say that there's a strong correlation between the size of the institution and urbanicity again, so that's kind of why we're considering that a grouping factor. The larger institutions in busy cities where there's likely more to do, where visitors are rushing from point A to point B, the survey length is pretty short and the response rate is pretty low. But they're still acceptable. So just comparing this survey methodology to some of our previous attempts, we're 10 points higher than we have been in our email response rate. So we're considering this a more efficient method in collecting the same amount of visitor data. To answer Karen's question really quickly about breaking Cove's museums by age range or some feature, that's exactly what we're positioned to do next. So considering small museums against other small museums, and then large museums and other large museums, age range is tough. A lot of the museums that we're partnering with right now consider themselves science centers and or children's museums, and that delineating line is very blurry because all museums say they're all ages, and the children's museums are like, but we're age appropriate for, we want to attract the larger. So it's kind of tough for us to start doing that, but we've thought about different ways of giving institutions groups to compare themselves to and making sure they're okay with it first. I also want to note that knowing the statistical methodology that Karen was speaking of and the rigor that Mac has put into the activation lab, we have done 0 statistical tests so far. I'm not saying that you're statistically significantly different than anybody else yet, because we don't know that that's appropriate. We don't know what the groups for comparison are. We've thought about validating scales, and we've thought about a lot of the other technical aspects of this measurement, but when it comes to reporting out the data, and I think the question is, how did institutions seek to interpret potential meaning? We're giving them their data, and then we're having conversations with them about their data first. So we're not putting any evaluative interpretation on the data yet. We're talking to them. Why do you see this number? What did you expect this number to be? How does this compare with anything you've done previously or stuff like that? So we're really trying to do mutual meaning making with the data.
Well, we are rapidly approaching the end of the hour, which makes me sad because I feel like we've only begun to touch the tip of the iceberg, and I have a lot of questions left. Does anyone else have anything they want to ask before we have to wrap up? If no one does, then I'm going to insert my own question, which is, I wonder if anyone has opinions on the best ways or the logistics of sharing this kind of data, because I know I would love to get my hands on these kinds of data sets to be able to start thinking about different types of comparisons, especially for, writing evaluation proposals. It's really helpful to know the refusal rate for different sizes of institutions and things like that. There's just so many different reasons this data could be useful, but also lots of issues for sharing it and for providing people with sufficient understanding for using the data. Just any thoughts on how to approach that topic?
I can start, although our data won't answer many of the questions you just proposed. But what we did do is for one of the more recent ones, studies we conducted, we actually have released year one data. We went through the process of cleaning that and creating code books and pieces around it. And so we had a convening 6-9 months ago where we actually invited people to come that might be interested in using those data. And so far, the people have been doing a little bit of work with it towards dissertations and other pieces. And so those things are, we've attempted to navigate that, but it'd be cool to see the COVES data.
Yeah, and for the COVES data, I can't say anything definitively, but the discussion we're having around that is that we want this to be more open source and transparent than proprietary. We're not trying to develop something with federal grant money that then no one can use. We'd love to release the instrument, the questions, because they're not all that innovative. It's just about doing something systematically so that we can then develop a system for comparison. As far as the data themselves, we also have a plan to allow researchers to request the data, and then we release the data at certain intervals based on their application. There is some amount of vetting that we will do, like, are you human subjects trained? Do you promise to treat this data with respect? But again, the checks on that are limited. And we'd anonymize everything so that you couldn't tell institution A from institution B and then start pointing fingers or doing anything malicious with the data. Mm-hmm. So as long as we have this inherent promise that the data are to be used for good, then we plan on allowing the COVES data to be accessible.
I love the idea of sharing a code book of the process of coming up with the questions and things like that. I wonder if that's something that the case task force people who are on the call are going to take up with. I don't know what they're working on in that regard. If they're still with us.
Yes, if anyone from case wants to chime in.
We're still determining the scope of the task force's work with help from Amy and Matt. But certainly that could be something that we could take on a piece of in terms of if there was some format for sharing it in a way that a lot of people would have access to. I don't know. It's related to what we've been talking about, but I just don't know yet what form it would take because we haven't filled out the task force with all the members yet. We're still refining the scope of the program officers.
Well, this brings us to 4:00, and I don't want to keep our guests over time, just out of respect for everybody's schedules. But I really appreciate everybody participating today. We will be sending out a link to the recording and hopefully some notes that we put together. The slides, as Kim asked, will be made available. I think that shouldn't be a problem. So look for an email coming through from me, and maybe we can use that email chain as a way to continue the conversation later. Oh,
do you want to just pop on here? I'll bring my computer over.
Oh, how long ago did I?